Hello, I am Dale Denwalt. I'm sitting next to Scott Meacham, former Oklahoma Treasurer, former State Finance Director, and Secretary of Finance. And welcome. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you coming here to talk about Oklahoma's Rainy Day Fund. It's a very important part of state budget, of the money that Oklahoma has and has been for a while. And in your role under Governor Henry, which you served for a number of years, you dealt with that issue a lot, with lawmakers appropriating money, trying to fill budget holes or trying to fund services, and occasionally using the Rainy Day Fund. Now, the Pew Charitable Trust came out with a report that took a look at Oklahoma's Rainy Day Fund and compared all the states, and it looks like Oklahoma's doing pretty well. Is that your assessment of how we have our rainy day fund set up and the mechanisms for withdrawal?
Yeah, I think that Oklahoma actually is on the forefront, sort of in our budget stabilization mechanisms we have in place. And the two big things we have is sort of the constitutional balanced budget amendment, the limitation on what the legislature can appropriate, and then the rainy day fund that acts as sort of an inter-year within the year as well as between years budget stabilization fund. It really serves the citizens of Oklahoma very well.
And how hard was it to make a decision to pull money from the rainy day fund when you were in state government?
Well, it's interesting because we inherited a rainy day fund that was very low when we came into office, because the state had gone through the post 9/11 recession, and the rainy day fund had been pretty much exhausted. And then the economy started doing really well, so it started building. And there had been a history in the legislature of whenever there's something that they wanted to spend money on, like for example textbooks for kids or something, of going into the rainy day fund. And the first few years we really battled to protect the rainy day fund for what it was meant to do, and that's really to be a budget stabilization device. So it's sort of the initial debate was that, and there was a long sort of standing history of that, and we protected it. And then we decided, well, after we saw what had happened through that downturn, that it really wasn't big enough, that we needed, since our budget had grown since it was originally created, that it needed to expand also. So we actually sought and received a constitutional amendment to increase it to the size it's at today.
And Governor Mary Fallin likes to say, she said several times that when she came into office, there was less money in it than I actually have in my pocket right now. Was that just a function of what was going on at the time with the financial situation?
Yeah, if you remember, so we started off and came into office in 2003, 2004. And as I said, the state was coming out of the post 9/11 recession, and then we hit this period of probably prosperity like we hadn't seen before, and the rainy day fund filled up. Well, then 2008, 2009 hit the Great Recession, which devastated the whole economy of our whole country, and that's really what your rainy day fund's for. So we ended up using the rainy day fund then in the 2009, 2010 budgets to help stabilize. So when Governor Fallin came in, it's kind of the same thing we were at. She just came in after a recession, and the rainy day fund was empty.
One of the things that the Pew Charitable Trust talked about is that there may be a strategy for withdrawing from the rainy day fund, particularly when you know that you're in an economic downturn. The economic indicators suggest that you're going to have a tough budget year ahead, maybe a few tough budget years. There's a strategy that you might prescribe to that. Well, do you use your rainy day fund at the beginning or the end of the downturn? Did you ever put a lot of thinking into at what point in a recession you might use it?
Yeah, we talked about that quite a bit, in fact. And the deal is, again, sort of you have a national sort of think tank, and they sort of average everything right across the country. If you look at Oklahoma, typically our revenue cycle is driven by commodities price, in particular oil and gas. And so we know that it's going to follow that curve pretty much up and down as it does. And so there is sort of going to be a cyclical thing. And so typically, my theory was that you use your rainy day fund first, because otherwise you end up cutting, and you may not have to cut state services. So if you put it to the end, then you end up cutting state services that in fact you maybe didn't need to cut if you'd used it in the front. And so that was always my theory.
And the researchers did say that a lot of the best practices are really based on a state's own history and their own economy. I want to transition to a little bit more topical news we've heard about last few weeks is borrowing from the rainy day fund, using it as a cash flow way to make sure the state pays its bills. Because the legislature says this is how much we're going to spend on this and that, and it's got to be paid for. So the current Director of Finance, Preston Dorflinger, has made a decision to basically empty the rainy day fund of money. When you were in that position, did you ever borrow from the rainy day fund?
Yes, but I wouldn't really call it borrowing. So if you think about a state budget, our budget is on a fiscal year basis. And what the legislature does is it's given a spending authority from the State Board of Equalization. And that spending authority is up to 95% of expected state revenues. The legislature passes a budget, and then that budget is divided into 12ths. So the state finance director, or that position, has to basically each month give the agencies 1/12 of what their total appropriation is. Well, your money doesn't come in that way. Your money comes in very much in well-defined cycles. In particular, if you think about this time of year, what happens is all of your income tax revenue, or a lot of your income tax revenue, tends to come in post-April 15th. So what happens is people that are due refunds file for refunds early, usually end of January through the 1st of April. You'll get hit by a lot of outflows from refunds, and then your money comes in April 15th. So you always see a big spike in state collections. Well, if you're a state finance director, you have to, again, you're passing out not what actually comes in. Now, at the end of the year, it has to match up, right? And if it's going to be short, like they're predicting this year, they declare a revenue failure and they ratchet it back for each month going forward. But you pass it out. So the statutes allow the state finance director to go to any source of cash, just use the cash. And to say you're borrowing from the rainy day fund, you're really not borrowing. You're really using cash that's sitting there in this big pot, and then you're replenishing cash when future cash comes in. So it's just a cash transaction. You cannot, at the end of the day, have any net out of the rainy day fund. So at the end of June, the rainy day fund has to be where it was at the beginning of July, unless the legislature's appropriated some money out of it.
Right.
So, I heard the politics about it and all the to-do about it, but honestly, it's sort of a business as usual deal in state government.
One thing that I've learned is that lawmakers may be hesitant to use the rainy day fund if they know it's going to be used for cash flow for these transfers in the middle of the year. Does that strike a chord with you?
Well, so I think that's interesting. So would a lawmaker rather that their local school districts get a half an appropriation in 1 month because it happens to be the month of February when you're paying out a lot of refunds, or would they rather stabilize with the cash out of the rainy day fund that's going to come back in April, by the way? I mean, to me, that makes sense. We can't close our prisons down for a month because we don't have enough money. I mean, the state is a business, and that business has to have a consistent cash flow to keep it going. And so you have to use whatever mechanisms you have and cash you have to make that happen. Realizing, again, at the end of the day, it's got to all be back by the end of the fiscal year.
Very good. Well, really great discussion. Wish we could talk to you a little bit longer, but it's been very informative. Thanks so much for joining me and talking about the Rainy Day Fund. Stay with our coverage with News OK and the Oklahoman. I'm Dale Denwalt, your Capitol reporter.